The sun in Nevada didn't shine. It punished. It was noon in August, the kind of hour when even shadows seem to evaporate under the crushing weight of the sky. The air above the basin and range wasn't clear anymore. It was thick, trembling, and distorted, like looking through a sheet of cheap melting glass. Heat waves rose from the cracked earth, twisting the distant mountain ranges into ghostly shapes that flickered like mirages of a dying world. There was no wind. No breeze dared venture into this dead land at high noon. Silence draped over everything, heavy and suffocating like an invisible shroud. No crickets chirped. No rattlesnakes slithered through the brush. Even the hoofbeats of the old black horse beneath Elias Thorne were swallowed whole by the thick carpet of dust. The only sound that existed here was the beating of wings. Whap, whap, dry, rhythmic, patient. Elias pulled the brim of his battered Stetson low, shielding his eyes from the blinding glare. He didn't need to look up to know they were there. 3 of them, maybe 4, turkey vultures, the diligent grave diggers of the desert. They circled high above, tiny black dots stained against a sky the color of bleached lead. They weren't in a hurry. These birds understood the laws of time better than any human. They knew the heat would finish the job before the sun went down. They just had to wait. Elias spat a glob of saliva mixed with grit onto the roadside. It dried halfway before it even hit the ground. His throat was parched, but he didn't reach for his canteen. He had learned to ration his thirst during his years bounty hunting in Yuma. Drinking when you wanted was an indulgence. Drinking when you needed was survival. He nudged his heels into the horse's flanks. The animal snorted softly, badly shaking its dust-powdered head, its steps heavy but steady as it moved forward. Elias didn't intend to stop. He had no reason to. In this world he had chosen to turn his back on, curiosity was the shortest path to the grave. Up ahead, about 50 yards off the gravel-strewn trail, a pile of rags lay motionless beside a dead saguaro cactus. That was what the vultures were waiting for. Elias shot at a glance. Just a casual look, the professional habit of a man who had spent a lifetime observing things others ignored. A body, probably a down-on-his-luck prospector who had gambled his life against the desert and lost, or a drunkard who wandered too far from a saloon in Silver Springs. Whoever it was, they were just part of the landscape now, a banquet about to be served to the birds. "Let's go, old girl," Elias muttered, patting the horse's neck. "Not our business." The horse seemed to agree, continuing its march. But then, a sudden, faint breeze drifted past, carrying a strange scent that wormed its way into Elias's sharp senses. It wasn't the smell of decaying death. Not yet. It was the smell of fresh blood beginning to dry, mixed with the scent of cold sweat and the metallic tang of iron. But there was something else. The scent of lavender. Very faint, almost imperceptible amidst the acrid smell of hot rock and sagebrush. But it was there. The scent of civilization, of clean rooms utterly out of place in this hell on earth. Elias frowned. He intended to keep riding, but the black shadow above suddenly dropped in altitude. The tearing sound of massive wings slicing the air was audible now, like canvas ripping. The lead vulture, with its hideous, featherless red neck, landed on a dry branch just a few steps from the pile of rags. It cocked its bald head, beady black eyes staring emotionlessly at the prey, its sharp, hooked beak tapping lightly against the dead wood. Tap, tap. The sound felt like a nail being driven into Elias's eardrum. He let out a long, frustrated breath. Conscience is a persistent ghost, Elias thought. He had tried to kill it in Yuma 10 years ago, burying it in unmarked graves. But every now and then it would claw its way out of the earth at the most inconvenient times. Damn it, he cursed under his breath. Elias hauled on the reins. The black horse whinnied in protest, but obediently turned around. He didn't dismount immediately. He sat still in the saddle, his right hand hanging loose, but hovering right next to the grip of his worn Colt Peacemaker. He scanned the perimeter, rolling sand dunes, red sandstone rocks standing upright like giant tombstones. No sign of an ambush, just the heat, just the silence. Elias slid out of the saddle. His old leather boots hit the hard ground with a dry thud, kicking up a small puff of orange dust. He tied the reins to a low bush and pulled his Winchester rifle from the scabbard on the horse's flank. He didn't cock it, but his thumb rested ready on the hammer. He approached the body, step by step, slow and cautious. The crunch of gravel under his boots sounded strangely deafening in the stillness. The vulture on the branch hissed a threat, spreading its foul black wings in a display of dominance. Elias didn't bother looking at it. He simply raised the barrel of the gun slightly. The animal understood the language of violence. It stomped its feet in dissatisfaction, then took flight, circling back up to the sky to rejoin those who were waiting. Now it was just Elias and the bundle of rags. It was a girl. She lay face down, half her face buried in the hot sand. Her long hair, matted with sweat and dust, obscured most of her features. The dress she wore had once been white, or perhaps cream. But now it was a tattered mess, stained the reddish-brown of the earth and the dark crimson of dried blood. The back of the dress was torn open, revealing sun-scorched, blistered skin, crisscrossed with scratches from thorns and sharp rocks. She looked heartbreakingly small, like a porcelain doll someone had smashed and forgotten. The heat rising from the ground enveloped her like an oven. No one could survive this sun for more than 2 hours without water. Elias sighed, disappointment and exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. She was dead. Or if not, it was only a matter of minutes. He had wasted his time. He was about to turn and leave, to let the desert finish its work. That was the rule. The weak fall, the strong move on. But then his eyes stopped at the girl's right hand. The arm was stretched out forward, gaunt and pale beneath the dust. And the hand was clenched tight. Elias squinted, stepping closer, his shadow casting a pall over the girl. She was clutching a rock, a piece of granite with jagged edges, the size of a fist, stained with dry blood. Her knuckles were white, protruding from the sheer force of her grip. Even though she was unconscious, even though her body had collapsed, even though her mind had sunk into darkness, that hand refused to drop its weapon. Elias's old heart skipped a beat. That wasn't death. That was defiance. That was the silent rage of a creature refusing to surrender to fate. He had seen many people die. Cowboys by the gun, soldiers by disease, convicts by the noose. When they died, their hands usually went limp. They accepted it. But this girl wanted to smash death in the face if it dared come close. Elias felt a strange respect welling up inside him, overriding his caution. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the heat searing through his thick denim jeans. "Hey," he called out softly, his voice rasping. "Girl." No response, just the wind whistling gently through the thorn bushes, sounding like the whispers of lost souls. Elias reached out, intending to turn her over. His rough, calloused hand touched her shoulder. Hot. Her skin was burning like fire. A fever was consuming her from the inside, compounding with the furnace outside. He gently rolled her onto her back. Her face was revealed to the harsh sunlight. A young face, perhaps only 20, but etched with the hardships of a lifetime. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eye sockets dark and sunken. But it wasn't her face that caught Elias's attention. He looked down at her leg, and the world around him seemed to stop turning. The heat seemed to vanish, replaced by a chill that ran down his spine, freezing him to the marrow. The tattered dress revealed her left ankle. There, where the soft skin of a young woman should have been, was a mass of pulped, purple, swollen flesh. Pus and plasma seeped out, caking with the dust to form a grotesque crust. The stench of necrosis hit his nose, stronger than the smell of sulfur. But the cause of the wound was what made Elias's stomach churn. A shackle. It wasn't the crude, rusted iron used to tether horses or hold filthy criminals in a county jail. No, this was a masterpiece of cruelty. It was made of gleaming white steel, compact, hugging the ankle tight. The metal surface was etched with exquisite patterns, delicate winding vines, tiny roses, looking more like a piece of expensive jewelry than an instrument of torture. But its function was unmistakable. It had no standard lock. It was riveted shut. Once put on, the only way to remove it was to cut off the foot or have the master's key. How many miles had that cold steel ground against her flesh? 10? 20? Every step was a dull knife, slicing into skin. Every run tore open old wounds. Elias knew this type of shackle. He had seen it once, long ago, in a luxury train car heading south. It wasn't a shackle for prisoners. It was a brand of ownership, a mark for merchandise of particularly high value. Merchandise that could talk, cry, and serve. "Bastards!" Elias hissed through his teeth. The sound came out like the growl of a wounded animal. Anger flared within him, not a quick burning flame, but a slow, molten lava of destruction. He understood why the girl held the rock. She wasn't running from hunger or thirst. She was running from something 10,000 times worse than death. Elias Rideau reached for the canteen at his hip. He unscrewed the cap, poured a little water into it, and carefully dripped it onto the girl's cracked lips. "Drink," he whispered. "Just a little." The water touched her lips like a miracle. Survival instincts kicked in. She swallowed dryly, her throat convulsing in pain. Her eyelashes fluttered, shedding the dust clinging to them. And then she opened her eyes. Elias had braced himself to see gratitude or relief. He was wrong. Those eyes, God Almighty, those eyes were two bottomless pits of absolute terror. Her hazel irises dilated, fully reflecting Elias, a bearded, dusty man with a gun, as if reflecting the devil himself. The girl's body jerked as if electrocuted. She screamed, but her parched throat only managed a choked rasp. She thrashed wildly, trying to drag herself backward, her wounded heel plowing into the hot sand, causing fresh blood to well up. "No, no," she wheezed, her voice shattering like glass. Her hand swung up. The rock. She was still holding the rock. She swung it at Elias with every ounce of remaining strength. The blow was weak, slow. Elias caught her wrist easily. Her wrist was tiny, fragile as a dried twig in his large palm. But she didn't stop. She clawed, she struggled. Tears streaming from the corners of her eyes, washing away the dirt to leave long, streaked trails on her cheeks. Let me go, let go, she sobbed, a heart-wrenching sound in the vast desert. Easy now, girl, Elias said, his voice low, trying to maintain a facade of calm, though his heart was hammering. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help. Don't lie, she cut him off, her eyes wide, staring fixedly at the gun on Elias's hip. You found me. You always find me. She paused, breathing heavily, her chest heaving as if it might explode. Her gaze traveled from Elias's face down to the ankle shackle, then up to the azure sky where the vultures were still patiently circling. A wave of despair washed over her, the despair of an animal cornered and realizing there is no escape. She loosened her grip on the rock. It fell to the sand with a hopeless thud. She looked straight into Elias's eyes. This time, the madness was gone. Only a plea remained, a plea so cold and lucid it was terrifying. You have a gun, she said, her voice trembling but every word clear. Please, use it. Elias froze. What? Shoot me, the girl whispered, tears rolling down her chin, dripping onto her tattered bodice. Shoot me and leave me for the birds. I beg you, I'm begging you. She grabbed Elias's sleeve, her fingers digging into the rough fabric. Just don't take me back there. Don't take me back to the blue house. I'd rather die. I'd rather be picked clean by the birds than go back there. The blue house. The name hung in the scorching air like a curse. Elias had never heard the name, but he felt its weight in the way the girl uttered it. It held a primal fear, a fear that paralyzed reason and stripped away dignity. This girl would choose a painful, lonely death in the desert, eaten by scavengers, over returning to that place. Elias looked deep into her eyes. He saw darkness there, but he also saw light, the light of a fire that refused to go out. He looked at the exquisite shackle. He looked out at the vast desert, where freedom seemed endless, yet served as a graveyard for the weak. And he looked at his own hands, hands that had taken lives, hands that had made mistakes that could never be fixed. He could stand up. He could get on his horse, turn around and ride on. He could pretend he had never seen her, never heard this insane plea. That was the safe choice. That was the smart choice. But Elias Thorne had never been a smart man. The image of the child in Yuma flashed in his mind. The child who had died from a stray bullet from his own gun. 10 years had passed, yet the sound of that child's crying still haunted him every night. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance God or the devil had thrown down to him, a chance to balance the scales of karma. Elias exhaled, a breath that carried both resignation and resolve. He pulled his hand away from the girl's grip, but he didn't push her away. Nobody's dying today, he said, his tone as hard as cold steel. At least, not yet. He sheathed his rifle. No, wait. It was a knife. Elias pulled a stag-handled Bowie knife from his belt. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, shrinking her neck, waiting for the cold blade to slice across her throat. A resigned wait for death. But the blade didn't touch her neck. Swing. Elias sliced through the leather strap, dangling from the shackle, the piece that had snagged on the nearby bush, holding her like a trapped animal. "Name's Elias," he said, sliding the knife back into its sheath. He bent down, sliding his arms under the girl's knees and back, lifting her effortlessly. She was light, like a sack of feathers, and I don't work for any damn blue house. The girl opened her eyes, staring at him in shock. Her body went rigid in his arms, still daring not to believe what was happening. Elias carried her toward the horse. His boots crunched on the gravel, solid and commanding. What are you doing?" she rasped, the fear not yet gone. "They'll kill you. If you take me, they'll kill you." Elias set her on the saddle, carefully adjusting her so she wouldn't fall. He looked her in the eye, his ash-grey eyes gleaming with a cold but trustworthy light. "To kill me, they'd have to get in line," he replied, patting the black horse's neck. "And it's a long line." He swung up onto the horse, sitting behind her, wrapping his arms around her to grab the reins. The faint scent of lavender on her drifted up again, this time distinct, overpowering the stench of death from the desert. "Hold on tight," he ordered. "We've got a long ride home." Elias spurred the horse. The black stallion neighed, kicking up its hooves and breaking into a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. In the sky, the vultures screeched their piercing cries of disappointment. They flapped their wings, scattering to search for other carcasses. Their feast had been postponed, but Elias knew they wouldn't give up, just like the men who had chained this girl's feet wouldn't give up. He had just picked up trouble in the shape of a girl and the weight of a death sentence. The hot wind whipped against his face, tasting of salty sweat and the bitterness of fate. Elias Thorne, the man running from his past, had just turned around and looked it straight in the face. Darkness didn't fall upon Granite Peak. It rose from the abyssal canyons, swallowing the last bruised red light of dusk like a starving beast consuming its prey. Elias Thorne's cabin, perched precariously on a crag, jutting out from the cliff face like the nest of a solitary hawk that had grown weary of the sky. It wasn't exactly a house. It was a fortress raised from gnarly old pine logs and boulders, where the mountain wind whistled through the cracks, creating mournful, ghostly sounds that sounded like the weeping of unquiet souls. Elias urged the black horse up the final stretch of loose gravel. The beast snorted, its breath condensing into fragile wisps of white steam in the freezing night air, a brutal contrast to the scorching heat of noon. At this altitude, the cold had teeth, and it bit into flesh without mercy. He halted the horse before the cabin door. The thick oak door, reinforced with black iron bars, remained shut tight. Elias didn't dismount immediately. He sat still, listening. The wind, the rustle of pine needles, the hoot of a night owl from the distant valley. No strange footsteps, no smell of gunpowder. The place was still safe, at least for now. Elias slid to the ground, his legs wobbling slightly, stiff from too long in the saddle. He tied the reins, then turned to carry Sarah. The girl was half conscious, her body burning like a live coal wrapped in tattered cloth. Her head slumped against his shoulder, her hot breath hitting his neck, ragged and weak. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scent of pine resin, cold ash from the hearth, and old leather rushed out to greet him. It was the smell of solitude, the scent of a life designed to be undisturbed. Elias laid Sarah down on the bear hide rug in the corner. The hide was rough but warm, the only luxury in this ascetic cabin. The first thing Elias did wasn't check the wound, but light the lamp. He struck a match, the small flame flaring up and catching the oil wick. Yellow light flooded the room, pushing back the shadows dancing on the timber walls. Those shadows were long and twisted, looking like ghosts from Elias's past, gathering to see what he would do with this new trouble. He went to the fireplace and started a fire. Dry logs caught quickly, crackling cheerfully, bringing a bit of life to the frigid room. Only when the warmth began to spread did Elias return to the bedside. Sarah was awake. She lay curled up, eyes wide, staring at the soot-blackened ceiling. She was no longer thrashing as she had in the desert, but the tension in her muscles showed the fear was still there, intact, just shifted into a state of extreme alert. She looked like a wounded animal, cornered in a predator's den, lying dead still, so as not to provoke the enemy. Elias dragged a wooden chair over and sat down. His weight made the chair let out a dry creak. Sarah flinched, her eyes darting toward him like an arrow. "I need to look at the leg," Elias said, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if talking about fixing a broken horseshoe. Sarah didn't answer. She just slowly pulled her leg back, but the sharp pain from the wound crinkled her face. She bit her lip, stifling a moan. Elias didn't wait for permission. He reached out, gently but firmly grasping her ankle. His hand was large, rough, calloused from guns and reins, yet his touch was surprisingly light. He lifted her leg, bringing it closer to the lamplight. Under the yellow glow, the shackle revealed itself clearly, cruel and morbidly beautiful. The polished white steel reflected the firelight, the exquisitely carved vine patterns appearing to strangle her swollen ankle. The flesh underneath had turned black and purple. Blood and pus had dried, gluing the metal to the skin. The rim of the shackle had eaten deep into the meat, likely touching the periosteum. If he didn't get it off tonight, the leg would have to be sawed off by tomorrow, or she would die of blood poisoning. Elias sighed, a heavy breath, carrying the fatigue of a lifetime. He let go of her leg, stood up, and walked to the corner where a cluttered workbench stood. Sarah watched his every move. She saw him take out a bottle of whiskey with a faded label, a roll of clean cloth, and a set of metalworking tools, a small cold chisel, a hammer, and a pair of bolt cutters. Her body went rigid. She knew what was coming. Elias turned back. He tossed the metal tools into the roaring fire in the hearth. "To sterilize," he explained briefly, seeing the panic in Sarah's eyes, "and to soften the metal. This shackle is made of cold-tempered steel. A cold chisel would shatter your bone before it shattered the lock." He opened the bottle, tipping it back for a long swig. He didn't swallow immediately, swishing it around his mouth before gulping, feeling the burn run down his gullet. Then he handed the bottle to Sarah. "Drink," he ordered. "Drink a lot. It won't stop the pain, but it'll make you forget how much it hurts." Sarah took the bottle with trembling hands. She looked at him, then at the bottle. She had never drunk hard liquor, but the throbbing pain in her leg was screaming for release. She closed her eyes and tipped the bottle. The burning liquid assaulted her nose, scorching her throat and making her cough violently. But she took a second swallow, then a third. Elias watched her, his face impassive, though a private pity welled up inside him. He bent down and picked up a small, clean piece of pine from the woodpile. shaved off the splinters with his knife and handed it to her. "Bite on this," he said. "Don't bite your tongue. And don't scream. I don't want the wolves out there thinking I'm murdering someone." Sarah shoved the wood into her mouth, clamping her teeth down hard. The alcohol was starting to hit, spinning her head, but the fear remained brutally lucid. Elias went to the hearth. Using long tongs, he pulled the glowing red tools from the fire. The searing metal met the cold air with a hiss. The smell of hot iron mixed with burning wood created the distinct scent of a smithy, a place that forged weapons, and now, a place that forged freedom. He pulled his chair close to the bed, placing the tools on a wooden tray. He looked at Sarah again. Sweat beaded on her forehead, plastering strands of black hair to her temples. Her wide eyes were fixed on the glowing chisel in his hand. "Ready?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Sarah nodded, a weak but decisive nod. "Hold the leg tight," Elias said. One hand gripped Sarah's calf, pinning it to the mattress. With the other, he placed the chisel tip into the tiny gap between the shackle's joints, where the metal was thinnest. The heat from the chisel, radiating onto Sarah's inflamed skin, made her jerk, a choked moan, stifled by the block of wood. "Don't move," Elias growled, sweat starting to prickle his own forehead. This wasn't shoeing a horse. This was surgery on a living body using blacksmith tools. One slip, one slide of the chisel, and he would shatter her ankle. Clang. The first hammer blow struck the chisel head. The sharp sound rang through the small room. The shackle vibrated, transmitting the shockwaves straight into Sarah's marrow. She arched her back, lifting off the mattress, fingers clawing into the bare hide until her nails threatened to tear off. Clang, clang. Elias increased the force. He had to be fast. The metal was cooling. He focused his entire being on the chisel tip. The world narrowed down to the point of contact between iron and iron. He didn't hear the wind howling outside anymore. He only heard the girl's ragged, rapid breathing and the sound of her teeth grinding into the wood grain. Blood began to seep from the old wound, torn open by the impact. Dark red rivulets ran down her heel, dripping drip, drip onto the wooden floor. The metallic tang rose up, mixing with the whiskey and sweat. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't make a sound. Elias stole a glance at her face. Her eyes were squeezed shut, tears flowing in streams down her temples, but her jaw remained locked. Blood from her gums began to leak out, staining the pine block red. She was enduring pain that would make the toughest men he knew weep like children. That resilience terrified Elias. It also made him respect her more than anyone he had met in 10 years. This girl wasn't forged from fragile glass. She was forged from the same metal as that shackle. She just didn't know how to temper it yet. "Hang in there," Elias gritted his teeth. "Almost done." He swung the hammer harder. 1 blow, 2 blows, 3. Crack! An ear-splitting sound rang out, not metal on metal, but metal tearing apart. It echoed, humming in the cramped space like the death knell of slavery. The shackle popped open. 2 twisted pieces of steel fell to the floor, rolling and clinking softly before falling silent. Sarah went limp, collapsing onto the bed like a puppet with cut strings. The wood block fell from her mouth, stained with blood. She gasped, her chest heaving violently, but her eyes immediately sought her leg. It was gone. That cruel metal ring had vanished. All that remained was a deep, bruised, and bleeding indentation around her ankle, looking like a twisted smile. But she was free. Elias set the hammer down. His hand trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the release of tension. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a clean cloth, then returned to the role of healer, a role he was still unaccustomed to. He poured alcohol onto a clean cloth to wash the wound. When the alcohol hit raw flesh, Sarah flinched again, but this time she didn't bite anything. She just bit her lip, watching Elias work. His clumsiness was evident. Big hands, used to squeezing triggers or tying nooses, now felt awkward handling cotton and ointment. He applied an herbal salve to the wound, an Indian remedy he'd learned to mix. The pungent smell of herbs overpowered the stench of blood. He bandaged her, loop after loop of white cloth around the bruised ankle, not too tight, not too loose. He did it with intense concentration, as if performing a religious rite. Sarah lay still, watching him through wet lashes. In her years at the Blue House, she had grown used to how men looked at her. Lustful, possessive eyes that saw her as an expensive toy or a pet. She had expected that look from Elias. She had expected him to demand a price for this help. But no. Elias's gaze as he looked at her wound was completely void of lust. It held only silent pity and a strange respect. He looked at the scar on her leg, the way an old soldier looks at a bullet wound on a comrade, not with disgust, but with understanding. He touched her flesh not to possess, but to mend. For the first time in years, Sarah felt seen as a human being. "Done," Elias said hoarsely, tying the final knot. He stood up, clearing away the bloody cotton. "It'll hurt more tomorrow than it does today, but at least you get to keep the leg." He picked up Sarah's tattered shoe lying on the floor. It was just a mess of shredded leather, the sole peeling off. He intended to toss it into the fire. It was worthless now, but as he held it, his hand paused. The sole was thicker than normal, and it was unusually stiff at the heel. Elias frowned. The suspicious habits of a bounty hunter resurfaced. He flipped the shoe over, prying his knife forcefully into the gap between the lining and the rubber sole. The sole split open. Inside wasn't wood or cardboard filler. Inside was a wad of thin silk, folded, small and pressed flat. Elias's heart gave a hard thump. He glanced at Sarah. The girl's eyes were closed. She seemed to have drifted off from exhaustion and the whiskey. He slowly pulled the fabric out. It was stained with grit and sweat, the edges frayed. He spread it out under the oil lamp. It wasn't plain silk. It was covered in tiny handwritten scrawls, reddish-brown ink, blood. It was written in diluted blood or some homemade ink. Elias squinted to read. Left column, names. Emily, 7. Thomas, 9. Mary, 5. There were dozens of such names, some crossed out, some marked with stars. Right column, other names, names of adults. And this was when the blood in Elias's veins turned to ice. He saw familiar names, names spoken with respect, fear, or both. Bankers, mine owners, senators, and near the bottom of the list, a name bolded, written carefully, but with palpable hatred. Judge Archibald Sterling. Next to his name was a small note, special priority, September shipment. Elias let his hand drop. The silk cloth floated gently onto the wooden table. He thought he had just saved a runaway slave girl, a small act of charity to atone for his sins. He was wrong. He had saved a bomb. This scrap of fabric wasn't just a list. It was a death warrant for anyone holding it. and it was proof that the rot wasn't just in the gutters. It sat right in the ivory tower of power. Judge Sterling, the representative of law, order, and morality for this entire region, was a client of the Blue House. Elias turned back to look at Sarah. The small, gaunt girl, curled up on the bed, wasn't just a victim. She was a living witness. She had carried the darkest secret of the entire West in the sole of her shoe, crossing the desert, enduring the torture of the iron shackle just to keep those names from being forgotten. A chill ran down Elias's spine, but this time, not from fear. It was the chill of realization. The false peace he had tried to build for 10 years on this cliff had just officially collapsed. He walked to the window, staring out into the pitch-black night. The wind howled through the crevices, sounding like fate mocking him. Elias reached for his tobacco pouch, his fingers trembling slightly as he rolled a cigarette. He lit it, taking a deep drag, letting the acrid smoke fill his lungs. "Girl," Elias whispered into the darkness, smoke drifting around his weathered face, "you just made me an enemy of God himself." But looking back at Sarah, watching her chest rise and fall steadily in the first deep sleep of freedom, Elias realized something else. He didn't regret it. The Winchester rifle hanging on the wall reflected the flickering firelight, gleaming with cold steel. It had slept for too long. And tonight, Elias had the feeling that both he and that gun were waking up. Outside, the night seemed to thicken. Wolves began to howl from the valley, long, mournful, and menacing calls. But this time, Elias didn't feel alone. In this tiny cabin, amidst the vast ocean of night, there were two broken people and a truth waiting to burn the world down when the sun came up. 2 days after the storm that night, the cabin on Granite Peak sank into an eerie stillness. It was the kind of quiet found on a lake so placid it mirrored the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, beautiful but fragile, waiting to be shattered by a single pebble. The morning began with the sharp scent of burnt coffee and pine resin assaulting the nose. Elias Thorne sat on the wooden steps of the porch, clutching a steaming tin cup, his ash-grey eyes squinting down into the valley below. Mist still clung to the fir trees, forming ribbons of white silk that embraced the red rock slopes. 10 years ago, this scene would have put him on edge, but for the last decade, it had been the only sedative for his tattered soul. A limping sound came from behind him. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of a crude wooden crutch hitting the floorboards. Elias didn't turn his head. He knew Sarah was up. He had whittled that crutch for her from an old oak branch yesterday afternoon, after seeing her try to stand and collapse from the pain. This girl had a head harder than granite. She refused to stay put, even though the leg recently freed from the iron shackle was still swollen and weeping blood. "Coffee?" Elias asked, his gravelly voice blending with the mountain wind. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice still weak but lacking some of the feverish tremors. Elias poured a cup from the blackened kettle sitting on the coals and handed it to her. Sarah took it and sat on a stool by the window, keeping enough distance to respect his privacy, but close enough to feel safe. The last 2 days had passed in necessary silence. They didn't speak much. Elias changed bandages, cooked soup, and Sarah slept. Her sleep wasn't peaceful. She would startle, scream unconsciously, calling out names he didn't know. But every time she woke and saw Elias sitting there, cleaning a gun or reading a tattered book, she would calm down. But this morning was different. The silence between them was heavier. It held unspoken things, secrets festering like the wound on her leg. Sarah took a sip of coffee, the bitterness making her grimace, but it cleared her head. She looked out into the distance, her gaze resting on the eagles circling high above. "It's not an orphanage," she spoke up suddenly. Her voice was small but clear, cutting through the whistling wind. Elias showed no surprise. He kept watching the valley, but the hand holding his coffee cup tightened slightly. "I know. No orphanage uses leg shackles." "You don't understand," Sarah shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. "The Blue House. On the outside, it's paradise. White painted walls, rose gardens, pretty dresses, good meals. The townspeople call Judge Sterling a living saint for taking in stray children." She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to dive into a frozen lake. "But in the basement, that's where the auctions happen. Not land or cattle auctions. Auctions of innocence." Her voice began to tremble, not from fear, but from the revulsion rising from her gut. "Sterling doesn't do it alone. He has a whole network. Important men, men who look pious, going to church every Sunday. They're all on that list." Elias remained silent. He had seen the list. He had seen the names. But hearing it from the victim's mouth gave it a different weight. It turned ink on silk into flesh and blood. "Why do you have it?" Elias asked. "I didn't plan to take it," Sarah whispered. "I was a tutor for Sterling's stepdaughter. I was allowed in the study. That night, I heard crying. Crying coming from under the floorboards. I was curious. Stupid curiosity." She closed her eyes, a tear rolling down her gaunt cheek. "I found the way down to the basement. I saw Emily." The name Emily fell into the room like a lead bullet. "My little sister," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I thought she had died of smallpox 3 years ago in the refugee camp, but no. She was there, chained, just like I was later. She's only 12, Elias, 12. Elias closed his eyes. The image of the child in Yuma 10 years ago returned, overlaying the image of a girl named Emily he had never met. Guilt, his most loyal companion, began to claw at his chest again. "I tried to get her out," Sarah continued, her hand gripping the wooden crutch tight. "But we were caught. I stole the ledger and the client list to use as leverage, to trade for Emily's freedom. But Sterling, he cared less about the safety of the secret than he did about punishing a traitor. He caught me. He put this shackle on my leg. He said he'd keep me alive long enough to watch Emily be sold before killing me." She turned to look at Elias. Her eyes burned, a fire of hatred and despair. "I escaped when they were moving me to a holding camp out in the desert. I ran, Elias. I ran for my life, not to save myself. I ran to find someone who could help me go back and save Emily, but no one dared help. The sheriff is Sterling's man. The mayor is his drinking buddy. The whole territory belongs to him." Sarah stood up abruptly. Pain made her sway, but she leaned on the crutch and stood straight. She moved toward her tattered canvas bag and began stuffing her few belongings into it. "What are you doing?" Elias asked, his voice icy. "I have to go," Sarah said hurriedly, her hands trembling as she shoved a washcloth into the bag. "Sterling won't stop. He'll send the cleaners. Those men, they aren't human. They are killing machines. If I stay here, you'll die. You're a good man, Elias. You don't deserve to be dragged into this mud." "Sit down," Elias ordered. Not loudly, but the authority in his voice made Sarah freeze. "You don't understand," Sarah screamed, turning to face him. "You're just a rancher, a hermit. You don't know how cruel they are. They'll burn this cabin down, they'll kill your horse, and they'll hang you from that pine tree just to make an example." Elias set his coffee cup on the floor. He stood up, slowly walking toward Sarah. He was a head taller than her, his shadow enveloping her, but there was no threat, only the solidity of mountain rock. "You're right about one thing," Elias said, his voice low. "I am a hermit." He looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time, Sarah saw something else in those weary, ash-grey eyes. A sharp, dangerous glint, like the reflection off a razor blade. "But you're wrong about the men who are coming," Elias continued. "I know them. I know their kind. Because there was a time. I was one of them." Sarah was stunned. She stared at him, mouth slightly open, unable to speak. Elias offered no further explanation. He turned and walked to the door. "Stay inside, don't come out until I say so." He stepped onto the porch. The air outside had changed. It was in the small signs a normal person would never notice. But to Elias Thorne, a man who had survived border wars and the bloodiest manhunts, they were as clear as a siren. First was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The pine forests surrounding Granite Peak was usually noisy in the morning. Steller's jays, the yelled loudest and most quarrelsome birds in the mountains, usually squawked for food. Chipmunks usually skittered through the dry leaves, but now everything was silent. This silence wasn't peace, it was fear. The forest animals knew a predator was near, and they were holding their breath. Second was the stream. Elias walked down the path to the small creek, his only source of water. The water usually trickled, crystal clear. But today, it was still. He knelt by the bank. The stream bed was nothing but mud and small, stagnant puddles. The flow had been blocked upstream. Elias swiped a finger through the mud and brought it to his nose. It smelled of raw earth. But mixed in with it, he caught another scent, very faint, but unmistakable. Turkish tobacco. The expensive kind mercenaries smoked, and the smell of freshly oiled guns. The Cleaners, a name that sounded so tidy. Sterling hadn't sent the sheriff or some drunken cowboys. He had sent his most professional hounds. Cutting off the water was a basic lesson in siege tactics. Force the prey out of the den with thirst, or force them to split up to find water. They weren't rushing to attack. They were tightening the noose, slowly, enjoying the prey's fear. They wanted him to know they were here. It was a psychological game. Elias stood up, dusting off his knees. A half smile, dry and cold, appeared on his aged face. "Mistake," he mumbled to the empty air. "You cut off the water for a deer, but you forgot to check if there was a bear in the cave." He turned and walked quickly back to the cabin. His steps were no longer the heavy plod of an old horse breeder. They became light, decisive, and soundless. They were the footsteps of the reaper. When Elias entered the house, Sarah was still standing there, leaning against the wooden table, looking utterly terrified. "Elias?" He didn't answer. He walked straight to the center of the room, where an old sheepskin rug lay on the floor. He kicked the rug aside with a decisive motion, sending dust flying. Beneath the rug were pine floorboards, fitted tightly together. Elias knelt, using his knife to pry up a board that seemed looser than the others. Creak. The wood groaned. A secret trap door was revealed. A different scent wafted up from the darkness beneath the floor. Not mold. It was the smell of gun oil, fine leather and cold gunpowder, the smell of the past, the smell of canned violence. Sarah held her breath as she watched Elias reach down into the hidden cellar. He pulled up an oak chest, reinforced with iron, heavy and black. It looked like a small coffin for a child. Elias placed the chest on the table. His hand glided over the lid, caressing the scratches on the wood as if greeting an old friend long unseen. He pulled a brass key on a chain from around his neck and inserted it into the rusted lock. Click. The unlocking sound was crisp and cold, like a hammer cocking back. Elias opened the lid. Sarah drew in a sharp breath. Inside the chest, resting on faded red velvet, were the tools of an artist of death. A Winchester model, 1873 rifle. Its stock, polished black walnut. Its blued steel barrel, cold and rust-free. This was the gun that won the West. And in Elias's hands, it had once been the terror of every bandit gang from the Mexican border to Arizona. Beside it lay a pair of Colt single-action army revolvers, their grips inlaid with yellowing mother-of-pearl, resting silently in intricately carved holsters, and knives, daggers, Bowie knives, sharp and gleaming, arranged neatly like the fangs of a beast. Elias didn't look at Sarah. He picked up the Winchester, checking the action. He brought the gun to his nose, inhaling the familiar scent of machine oil. It awakened every sense in him. It awakened reflexes that had been asleep. It awakened the butcher of humor. He began to load it. One by one, shiny brass cartridges were pushed into the loading gate. Click, click, click. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. "You?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she watched the transformation of the man before her. "Who are you?" Elias paused. He set the gun down on the table and turned to look at her. The gentle, weathered face of the old rancher was gone. In its place was a cold visage, eyes sharp as razors, radiating a murderous aura that made the air in the room seem to freeze. "I used to be many things, Sarah," Elias said, his voice no longer gravelly but resonant and clear. "Bounty hunter, hitman, butcher. I buried all those names under this floor 10 years ago." He picked up a bandolier and slung it across his chest. The weight of the bullets pressed on his shoulder, but he felt lighter, as if he had just found his center of gravity again. "Sterling made 2 big mistakes," Elias said, checking the cylinder of a Colt. "First, he hurt a child, and second, he woke this old dog up in the middle of a nap." He walked over to Sarah and pressed a small, short-barreled gun into her hand. A 2-barreled Derringer, a weapon of last resort. "Keep this," he instructed. "If anyone walks through that door who isn't me, don't hesitate. Shoot them in the center of the chest. Don't aim for the head. Their heads are small and they move. The chest is the best target." Sarah held the cold gun in her hand, looking into Elias's eyes. "Why? Why are you doing this? You could leave. You could let me go. You don't owe me anything." Elias adjusted the brim of his Stetson. He looked out the window, where the shadows of the pine forest were beginning to lengthen as the sun dipped into the afternoon. He knew the cleaners were waiting for darkness to strike. He turned back, looking deep into Sarah's fearful but resilient brown eyes. "You're right, Sarah. I don't owe you," Elias said, a sad smile flickering on his lips. "I owe myself. For 10 years, Every night, I've seen the face of the child I killed by mistake in Yuma. I've lived like a ghost, hiding from my conscience." He picked up the Winchester, levering around into the chamber. The clack-clack sound rang out with authority, signaling the end of peace and the beginning of war. "Today, I'm not fighting for a bounty. I'm not fighting for justice or any damn law. I'm fighting because tonight, if I survive, I want a good night's sleep. A sleep without dreams." Elias Thorne walked to the door, his long shadow falling across the floorboards, covering the empty chest. He stood on the porch, taking a deep breath of the mountain wind, the pine resin, and the lurking enemy. Beneath the aged shell, the blood of the predator had begun to boil again. His fingers no longer trembled. His heart beat slowly, powerfully, like a war drum. He didn't wait for the storm to come. He was the storm. And as darkness swallowed Granite Peak, the first gunshot rang out, tearing through the false silence, announcing to the entire valley, the ghost was awake and it was hungry for redemption.